Welcome back to another episode of the Injury Law Pod. I am your host, Eric Bartlett, 29-year personal injury lawyer, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things personal injury law related. And up today, 'tis the season. Winter is upon us, even though not officially. Just imagine Monday morning, December 1st, the snow rolled in faster than was predicted. Highways in Missouri turned into parking lots and there were spinouts everywhere. So maybe you were one of the drivers that were crawling along I-35 or stuck behind a line of semis on I-70. But we had our first real taste of winter storms and everything that comes out of that, which is traffic nightmares. So today we're going to break down a little bit about what it looks like when there is a traffic crash during a snowstorm. And if you're one of the unlucky people that finds themselves in that situation, what your rights are, how you go about getting compensated, what fault looks like, all those types of things. So, just as a quick recap on the Monday storm, again, there was an early winter storm. It came in, I think, much earlier than certainly what I had seen. Everything was indicating it might start snowing after 9 a.m. But I remember waking up after around 6:30 and snow was already on the ground. And then it quickly picked up after that and snowed for most of the day. Schools didn't cancel, but they ended up closing early. And it sounds like MoDOT didn't pre-treat the roadways. And so there was a lot of traffic on the roads. There were untreated roads, and it created a pretty significant event. I think most areas saw anywhere from 2 to 5 inches of snow. And again, because of the temperatures, the road conditions deteriorated rapidly. And again, the big corridors like I-70, I-35, I-44 all became a really big mess, not to mention all the side roads. The Missouri Highway Patrol, their winter weather totals after the storm onset, this was all the troops in Missouri reporting in. There were 1,374 calls for service that day. There were 597 stranded motorists, 285 crashes, 27 injuries, and thankfully, no fatalities. And thankfully, no fatalities were reported out of any of these accidents. Now, in Kansas City, for example, again, this was considered a record snowfall for December 1. Dozens of crashes that led to the closures of at least 4 interstates, which was I-70, I-670, I-35, and US 71. That was before noon. And MoDOT's own traveler map on Monday showed multiple winter weather closures and lingering impacts even into Tuesday morning. Now, again, as I just mentioned, MoDOT did not pre-treat the roads before Monday's storm in certain regions, and they were basically, they said the snow was expected later, which just contributed to the slick highways and the gridlock that everyone experienced. But it got blasted on social media. There was political attention, public frustration. And again, without taking a purely political stance, this is just highlighting the reality that drivers faced on Monday. So that's what the numbers say. Now let's talk about what that means legally. Again, if you were one of the people caught in this mess, let's talk about some of the most common scenarios that we see, because after a day like that, our calls pick up. Obviously, there's accidents happening, people are getting hurt, and they're reaching out to see how we can help. And so, again, we're seeing rear end collisions in stop and go traffic, multiple vehicle pileups when someone drives too fast for the conditions, semi truck jackknives, and losing control on bridges and overpasses, and then single vehicle runoffs caused by speeding, maybe tires that aren't up to the task, or sudden braking on slick conditions. Now, what we can run into here is the idea that it was the snow's fault, it was the road conditions' fault versus legal fault. And here's how this breaks down. Bad weather is a factor, but that doesn't excuse drivers because, as we have talked about before, when you're behind the wheel of a vehicle, you have the duty to exercise the highest degree of care. And that duty, it's not a static situation. It fluctuates based on the conditions present. So, for example, you might drive in one way during the daytime. You might need to drive a different way at night because you're faced with different conditions. And that goes with weather as well. Again, you probably are going to drive differently when it's pouring down rain as opposed to when it's a beautiful, sunny, clear day. And when it's snowing heavily and the roads are deteriorating, that's a time where drivers have to drive safely for those conditions. They have to slow down. They have to increase their following distance, probably leave earlier so they're not in a rush. You have to understand how your car is going to behave in these conditions. You have to be mindful of slick areas on the road, and you just have to drive in a completely different manner than you might otherwise do when none of that is in play. So, this is how investigators and insurance adjusters look at these types of accidents. What were the speeds relative to the conditions? What was the following distance? And was there the proper use of headlights, proper tires on the vehicle? Were there safe lane changes involved? All things that are going to impact a claim and how it's presented and how it's made. So we always talk about fault being assessed between the parties that are involved in a claim. Again, the person making the claim, we can look at what their driving was like, and then the person that is having the claim made against them, what was their driving like? Whose actions contributed to this accident? And again, that's a spectrum because let's say, for example, the rear end collision, somebody's sitting still, somebody else comes up behind them, doesn't stop in time, rear ends their vehicle. In that situation, fault is completely on the driver that rear ended the other car. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum a situation maybe where the person making the claim, they lost control of their vehicle, and in some way, shape, or form, another vehicle comes along and collides with that out of control vehicle. And now the question becomes, so what was the person doing that is making the claim? Why did they lose control of their vehicle in the first place? And did they create a situation where this other driver couldn't avoid the collision? And then, of course, you have everything in the middle. So again, it's a spectrum. It takes every case, every particular fact situation to determine, can a claim be made? And if so, what the fault assessment is going to be. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that if you're in an accident like this and you're hurt and you believe somebody's at fault, even if you feel like you're partly at fault, you shouldn't assume that you don't have a claim because there still may be recoverable damages depending on Missouri law and the specific facts at hand. So again, it's always going to be a situation where we're looking at that accident and exactly what happened. Okay, so if you find yourself in this situation, there's an accident in a snowstorm due to bad road conditions, what should you do? Obviously, number one, you got to check for injuries of yourself, of others involved, probably call 911 during an event like that, right? If there's no real apparent injury, you're probably going to hear the police tell you that you aren't going to get the police to show up because they're at that point overwhelmed. They're trying to deal with all kinds of calls. And we're looking at obviously the situation where there's more serious injuries involved. But again, you've got to make sure you're checking yourself and others out. You're calling 911 if people are seriously injured. And again, in that immediate aftermath, if possible, and it's safe to do, move the vehicles out of traffic to avoid secondary crashes. Again, a lot of people always think they need to just leave their vehicles right where they were after the accident, but that's not true. You can get vehicles out of the way to, again, number one, free up traffic. Number two, not create an additional hazard. It's very important. But again, you got to make sure it's safe to do that, to get out of your vehicle, all those types of things. That's a judgment call. Again, turn on your hazard lights if there's low visibility because of snowing. Lights are important. If you carry anything like reflective triangles or flares in your car, anything to bring attention, get those out there. And then always stay inside your vehicle if conditions are too dangerous outside. So many people, they get out of their car, they're standing alongside that, and here comes a car and ends up hitting them as a pedestrian at that point. And obviously, that's a much more dangerous situation and obviously much more likely to sustain injury with that scenario. So you just want to make sure you're really thinking it through after an accident like this. What's the best plan of action at this moment to stay safe until some kind of help arrives? Now, as always, if you've been in an accident, getting photos or videos, especially for this kind of an accident, the road surface, the snow, ice accumulation, any ruts in the snow or ice, untreated pavement, whatever the scene looks like, the vehicles that are involved. Again, if you do before you move them and you get pictures of where they were, things like that, great. It's not necessary. Again, your safety is first, and getting out of hazards way is more important. But getting photos of the vehicles and or video if they're damaged, things like that, always very helpful moving forward down the road with some kind of a claim. And again, another good idea is road signs, speed limit signs, curve warnings, any blocked lanes. If it's around a bridge, what did the bridge look like? Bridges always get icy before anything else. And were there any signs indicating a warning about the bridge's icing before the rest of the roadway? Again, lots of pictures, take as many as you can. Obviously, everybody has a phone, and so it's pretty easy today to do that. And then the other thing is going to be trying to capture the weather context. Again, if it's snowing and that can be captured by video or photo, whatever that looks like, to show visibility, ongoing snowfall, plow activity or lack of it, screenshots of weather apps or MoDOT traveler maps right at that time. Very useful. And showing closures, conditions, whatever that looks like. And here in Missouri, again, MoDOT offers all of that. They have an app, they have a website. And so you can really gather a lot of potentially important information and possible evidence going forward with making a claim. And then, as always, get the other driver's name, insurance information, maybe grab a license plate, things like that, just in case down the road there's an issue identifying who it is. Any witnesses, again, always getting names, phone numbers, whatever that looks like of witnesses is really important, especially in chain reaction collisions, because those are so difficult to parse out what vehicle started the whole thing and what other drivers' involvement might be. And there's then insurance companies trying to figure out who's on first, who's on second, who's on third. And we actually had one of those call in where it was a four-car event, and insurance companies are still trying to figure out exactly who's going to be taking ultimate responsibility. Fortunately, the person that called us was the very front vehicle. They didn't have any fault in it, but there's three vehicles behind them, and those insurance companies have to figure out who started the whole thing. So, when you're dealing with insurance companies out of this, adjusters, insurance adjusters very well may try to blame just the weather to minimize payouts. And that's something to keep in mind. And this is a good reason, if you've been in one of these types of situations and you're seriously hurt, reaching out to a personal injury lawyer sooner rather than later is absolutely in your best interest. Again, there's going to be, for example, out of this snowstorm with the high volume of crashes, your insurance companies are going to be flooded with claims. That's going to slow down response times. That's going to complicate investigations. And again, insurance companies, as always, are going to be looking for ways to not pay the fair value of a claim. And so it's very important that you get somebody in the mix that knows how to handle these claims and can take the reins and move it forward on your behalf if you've been seriously hurt. And again, as I always say, if you think you've been injured, go seek medical treatment, because it's better to get checked out initially. And if nothing more comes of it, then fine. But the problem is, if you wait and you don't get checked out for 2, 3, 4 weeks down the road, now the insurance company is going to have an argument about the gap in time, what was going on, why didn't you complain about an injury initially, and things like that. But if you create a record from the beginning of any possible concerns that you have, and then you do take a break and try to see if it's going to heal up on its own, you had the initial complaints. And so it's not something coming out of the blue down the road. So that's very important. Seek medical care if you think you're hurt. Don't try to tough it out. Now, here's the thing. In all of this, we've talked about, say, for example, the transportation department, right? Again, we can talk about Missouri Department of Transportation and where they might fit in on this type of a claim. The failure to pre-treat or clear the roads quickly is frustrating for everybody involved, but pursuing claims against the state agency, it involves sovereign immunity limitations. That's the idea that you can't just sue the government for anything. There's very limited exceptions. There's strict notice and timing rules that are involved. And there's certainly no clear cut path to holding a government transportation department responsible out of an accident like this. Again, it's generally going to fall to the drivers who are aware of the conditions and should be driving accordingly. Most winter crash claims are still primarily going to be against negligent drivers and or possible commercial carriers if you have a large truck involved or something like that, even when road treatment is an issue. Because again, you have a major storm like this come in, and logistically, there's only so much that the government transportation department can do to get these roads cleared and back to a safe operating situation. So you just have to remember that you're going to primarily be looking at the negligent driver to make a claim for any serious injuries you have out of an accident. But let's keep this in mind. Don't assume that you don't have any options just because the roads were bad. Just because there's a weather event occurring, there's a lot of accidents happening, that doesn't mean it's a free for all out there. We still, as drivers of vehicles on the roadways, have duties that we have to maintain, and we have to drive safely, and we have to adjust our driving for the conditions that are present. So, when is a really good time? Again, I've already talked about to call a lawyer. Again, red flags that should jump out are serious injuries or a hospital stay. That obviously takes it to the next level. Somebody's seriously hurt. Now there's going to be significant medical bills, probably lost time from work, obviously significant pain and suffering, things like that. That's a good time. That's a red flag. Commercial vehicles involved. We've talked about this in the past. If you have a big truck involved, there's a big company behind that truck. There's a big insurance company behind that truck, and they will absolutely have their legal people investigating and working on this claim. And if you think you're going to go it alone and you're going to have any success against a company like that, you're mistaken. It's not going to happen. Again, if there's disputes over who was at fault, that's a red flag. And obviously, multiple vehicle pileups, conflicting stories, things like that. You're probably going to want to have a lawyer involved to try and figure out who exactly was at fault, especially if you know you weren't, right? Then it makes the most sense. Get somebody involved to fight it out with these insurance companies and figure out where the blame rests so that you can worry about your medical situation, getting better, and not have all the legal headaches that can go along with these types of claims. Here's your winter driving checklist going forward for the rest of the season. Now that we've had a taste of it, I have a feeling there'll be plenty of more of these incidents. So make sure you have a snow or ice safety kit. You got a blanket, phone charger, scraper, small shovel, kitty litter or sand to help if you have a traction problem, you get stuck on the roadway, all that kind of stuff. You should have that during the winter in your hatch or your trunk. Make sure your tires are in good condition and properly inflated. Again, for 30 seconds is the acceptable tread depth for tires to pass state safety inspections. But I will tell you, that is the bare minimum. It's not awesome, especially in wintertime. And the age of the tire matters. Most places recommend tires are replaced after 6 years, regardless of tread depth. 10 years is a critical replacement time. So if you've had your tires on your vehicle for a really long time, it's time to get into a tire shop, have them checked out. Make sure your tires, which are so critical to bad road conditions, make sure those tires are up for the challenge. And always remember, if it's going to be bad weather, keep your gas tank at least half full during these storms because you never know when you might be sitting on a highway for hours because of an accident and the road closure or anything like that. And you certainly don't want to be one of the people that runs out of gas and now has to deal with that situation. So when you're driving out there in these storms, remember, slow down, leave more space than you think you need, avoid sudden braking or lane changes, and do gentle steering inputs, right? No sudden big swerving maneuvers. Make sure you check the weather and MoDOT or the Kansas Department of Transportation. You know, you see what they're saying about the roads. You can look at their maps before you ever even leave. Get an idea of what's out there, get an idea of the best route to take. And if you don't have to get out, don't get out. That's the easiest way to avoid all of this. So Monday's snowstorm led to hundreds of crashes, stranded motorists statewide. Bad weather doesn't erase a driver's responsibility to drive safely. I want you to keep that in mind. And if you're in a winter crash, prioritize safety, document the conditions, get medical care, and consider calling a lawyer if you're seriously hurt out of this type of a collision. Till the next time, be safe, be well, and let's all get through winter together.